Give people one more minute. Women's suffrage, 19th Amendment. Good one. Very good answer. Okay, everybody, we will get started in 1 minute. We're going to look at all the amendments today and the grouping. So it is officially time. We'll begin the recording. Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. Today's class is all about the amendments. So we're going to look at the amendments to the Constitution, 27 amendments in total. And as we do this, we're going to ask you kind of two fun questions. One, what's your favorite amendment? And two, if you had to add an amendment to the Constitution in the 28th Amendment, what would it be? And you can think about your answers now and the answers at the end of the class and see if they've changed. I know mine change constantly on those two. So my name is Carrie Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And I'll be here with you today. So ask lots of questions in the chat or the Q&A, and we will weave them into the class. But I'm also here with one of our top scholars at the Constitution Center, Tom Donnelly. So Tom, kick us off, get us started, and tell everybody your favorite amendment, and you can answer any way you want on this one.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My favorite amendment, probably the 14th Amendment, Curry, because it's like a mini constitution unto itself. It does so much and responds to so many of the constitutional debates in the decades leading up to that moment after the Civil War.
Awesome. And that'll be a fun one to get to about midstream in this class. So Tom, before we dive into all the amendments, we're going to pose some like big constitutional questions about the Constitution, how these amendments are grouped, but really it all begins with how do we even amend the Constitution in the first place? How does this work? And then how have people used the process in the 230 plus years since the Constitution has been ratified? So how the Constitutional Amendments change the Constitution? How do you actually add an amendment to the Constitution? And then how have they changed or modified the original or structural Constitution? So lots to do in this time period, not just to review all 27, but would you like to start with the process?
Absolutely. So yes, if we're looking for the amendment process in the Constitution, it's written in Article 5 of the Constitution. So the framers put that provision in place because they didn't believe they had all the answers. They were hoping that the American people over time would learn from experience and make the Constitution better. Article 5 lays out really a two-step process for how things become an amendment. I love this chart because it gives you sort of the absolute beginning to the absolute end. But really, formally in Article 5, there's two parts to it. First is the part where a new constitutional amendment is proposed. This is the proposal phase, and amendment can be proposed in one of two ways. First, Congress can propose an amendment. So if reformers can get a 2/3 vote in the US House of Representatives, a 2/3 vote in the US Senate, they can then propose an amendment to the American people for ratification or approval. So that's the first step. That's the first way to propose an amendment. It's the way that every amendment to the Constitution has been added. It's gone through Congress. But interestingly, Article 5 also puts in place a process for the states to get around Congress. So what if Congress doesn't want to reform the Constitution, doesn't want to amend the Constitution in a certain way? Well, the legislatures of 2/3 of the states can force Congress to call a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. Again, this has never happened before, but it's another process in place for proposing a new amendment. So that's the proposal phase. How does ratification work? So ratification, this is the part where the American people can then say yes or no to a new constitutional amendment. And Congress gets to choose how this process is going to work. They can either work through the state legislatures or through specially elected state ratifying conventions. But in either case, ratification requires 3/4 of the states. So what we see here is that the founders really put in place a really, really high bar for amending the Constitution. They wanted it to be hard. They wanted it to be possible, but they wanted it to be hard. They wanted it to be the sorts of reforms, the sorts of amendments that people broadly supported, that crossed factional lines, that crossed party lines. And that's how they set up this process.
Oh, and I really like that, Tom. So when we're thinking about the 28th Amendment, you might really want to think, if you're going to propose an amendment and you want it to get through, you need to propose an amendment that's going to cross party lines, be something that a multi-partisan group can get behind to move forward, because you're going to need that energy to pass that high bar. And students, just for everybody to know, on January 24th, we are going to do an entire class just on Article 5. So a great time to come back. And if you're thinking about amendments you want to propose, how can you get it done? That class will walk you through that process. Now, we're going to take the step back first and say 27 amendments have been added to the Constitution. They have mended the Constitution in some way and fashion. But when you look at these, they're not just sprinkled evenly across time, they come in groupings. And so can you kind of walk us through the 4 big groupings that you see these amendments kind of flurry into the Constitution?
Absolutely. So we're going to touch on every amendment, but here's just the big picture. The first thing to note is that first period, the founding period, the founding generation added 12 amendments almost immediately. So the Constitution, it's written in 1787, ratified 1789. Between 1791 and 1804, we add 12 amendments, including the Bill of Rights. But then there's a 60-year gap between the 12th Amendment and the 13th Amendment. And so it's then during Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War that scholars call America's second founding, that we ratify 3 transformational amendments. But again, a 60-year gap there. And then if we go from the 15th Amendment to the 16th Amendment, there's another 40-year gap until we get to the Progressive Era, until we have another amendment, the 16th. And then in that 7-year period, we amend the Constitution 4 times. And so that's during the Progressive Era, 1913, 1920. And then finally, what we broadly call the modern era, we get the rest of the amendments, those final 8 amendments between 1933 and 1992. But the thing to note again there, Curry, is that it's been almost 30 years since the last amendment. So what we see from this history is that often amendments come in waves.
Yeah, and we're almost due for a next wave. So get your ideas going. And we do call that modern era. It's like a caveat. It's kind of modern era. So, the big idea behind these amendments is that the Constitution was something that the founding generation knew should be edited, should be changed at times, but not on a whim. And Uriel just pointed that out in the chat, that it's not easy to change the amendments, but why is it not easy to change amendments? So can you walk us through these big ideas of these changes, why it takes such a difficult process, and also that there is a process in the first place?
Yeah, so I think the big point here is that the Constitution, it created the greatest charter of freedom in the history of the world, but the framers didn't think that they had all the answers. And so they put the Article 5 amendment process in there for the American people to make the Constitution better over time, but they wanted that process to be hard. They thought by making the process difficult, it would make sure that only really, 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 really good ideas would end up in the Constitution. And I think the important point, Curry, is not to look at the Constitution as a constitutional big bang, but instead as something where the Constitution has been transformed over time by the amendment process, where we've abolished slavery, promised the freedom and equality to everyone, added a Bill of Rights, protected voting rights for women and African Americans, and on and on. And so we've ratified these 27 amendments across American history to try to make the Constitution better.
And I will say, as we dive into this, remember, there have been some amendments that have gone really quickly. And so I always think about the 26th Amendment, we'll get to that, but that moved really quickly through the process. Okay, so let's start with the first 10, the founding period. They get the Constitution in 1787, give it to the states for ratification, and pretty quickly they add 10 amendments. And that's the biggest addition, the biggest bulk all at once. And so can you walk us through why? When they put it out there, did they have no clue what was missing? Why did they have to add so many amendments so quickly?
Absolutely. So the Bill of Rights, that's amendments 1 through 10 to the Constitution. They're written primarily by James Madison. They're proposed by the first Congress and quickly ratified by the states. And so by 1791, we already have the Bill of Rights written into the Constitution, and it didn't come out of nowhere, Curry. It emerged from the debates we had over whether or not to have a new Constitution in the first place. So the Bill of Rights, in part, was meant as a response to the debates we had at ratification, and especially the concerns of what were known as the anti-federalists. These were the people who opposed the Constitution. Part of the reason they opposed it was because it had no Bill of Rights and because they feared that the new national government was going to be too powerful. And so with the Bill of Rights, we tried to address at least some of those concerns.
So the subgroupings under the big groupings that we have there's actually groupings of the Bill of Rights to help our students remember them. So can you walk us through the groupings, and then we will quickly tick through all 10 of these amendments?
Absolutely. So we're borrowing these groupings from great friend of the Constitution Center, Yale's Akhil Amar. But the big ideas here in the amendments are we have the freedom of conscience, which is really the First Amendment, military amendments, which we say the Second and Third Amendments, then a couple of amendments dealing with privacy and property rights, which are the Fourth and the Fifth. And then you see a bunch of different amendments, 5, 6, 7, and 8, all dealing broadly with fair process, jury rights, and the rights of the accused. So the founding generation really cared about getting processes right and making sure that people were treated fairly. And then finally, 9 and 10, we get what can be termed popular sovereignty amendments, but really about a broad commitment to rights protections, but also to federalism, the traditional power of the states, not just the national government.
And I heard a scholar last week, probably last month, talk about, the Bill of Rights is added to the Constitution very quickly. And it is really does not really come into play for years. But it was important for the people to enshrine into that Constitution big principles that they believed in. And that it was the reason why. It doesn't mean you're going to use them right away, but sometimes it says, you know what, this principle is missing, so we want to make sure it's in here. So students, think about that as Tom ticks through all 10 of these amendments in lightning speed. First Amendment, freedom of conscience. Go, Tom.
Okay, so the First Amendment, the big idea here in the First Amendment is the freedom of conscience. It brings together a series of different rights. So it's really a bundle in and of itself, and it protects rights to religion, free speech, free press, assembly, and petition. So beginning with religion. So what does the First Amendment say about religious liberty? Well, it protects it in 2 separate ways. First, it guards against the government establishment of religion. And second, it protects the free exercise of religion. And so together, these constitutional promises, they're at the core of our freedom of conscience, sort of that right to freely believe or not as we wish. So that's religion, Curry. Speech and press really just goes to the big idea that we don't want the government choosing for us what is true or false. The government can't, generally speaking, punish people for what they say. The big test that we have is that, generally speaking, the government can't regulate speech unless it's likely to and directed to creating a really immediate lawless action. But I think the big idea to keep in mind, Curry, is that we really, really commit deeply to free speech in free press in this country. We've never at any time had it protected more broadly at the Supreme Court, and we have the broadest free speech and press protections probably in the entire world. And then finally, those last 2 rights, assembly and petition, we often forget, but they've been so important to groups that are excluded from the political process. People that don't have the right to vote or often political power often gather together through assembly and through petitioning, write out their ideas and their complaints about what's happening in this country, and groups like African Americans, women, unpopular political groups like those who opposed slavery in the 1800s, many groups who lacked political power used assembly and petition to make sure their voices are heard and eventually actually change our Constitution.
And they are so important, students, and we will send a follow-up email and link you to the class where we're just going to do the First Amendment speech, the First Amendment assembly and petition. So there's a lot coming up in this year's in classes. Now, Tom, you talked about the military amendment. So we're going to look at the Second and the Third Amendment, kind of help us understand why we group these as military amendments as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Second Amendment, for the founding generation, one of the key things there is they were concerned about professional armies. They thought that they were often the agents of tyranny, that they'd be used to oppress, to abuse the rights of the people. And so they really had a vision of the protection of both the community and the nation being rooted in a well-regulated, citizen-led and citizen-filled militia, but also consistent with what the Supreme Court has recently said in cases like Heller and McDonald. The Second Amendment also protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. So it does sort of both of those things. So that's the Second Amendment. The Third Amendment, Curry, protects us from being forced by the government to house soldiers in our homes. Now, this may seem like a really weird thing to focus on in the Bill of Rights, but for the early Americans, they remember the American colonists had to do this. With the British Quartering Act of 1774, it required American colonists, especially in Boston, to house British soldiers in their homes without any say. And we wanted to make sure, no, not in America. We're not going to have that here. We are not a military state. We don't believe in something like that. And so we wrote that vision into the Third Amendment.
Awesome. Okay, so the next two amendments, privacy and property. So myself and my stuff and my home is kind of how I group these together. But let's walk through these two amendments that are grouped under privacy and property, Fourth Amendment and Fifth Amendment.
Sure. So the Fourth Amendment is protecting us against what are unreasonable searches and seizures by the government. This is the amendment that really usually is regulating our interactions with police officers. That's usually the way in which it comes into play. And the amendment tells us a couple of different things, just if you look at the text. It tells us which sorts of things are protected: persons, houses, papers, and effects. Effects is it's just our stuff. And what it protects against is against unreasonable searches and seizures. The bottom line is that if the government wants to search our home, seize our property, seize us, it needs a good reason to do so. That's the big idea behind requiring, in many circumstances, police officers to get a warrant before doing those things.
And if they do seize us or our stuff, the Fifth Amendment kind of jumps in here.
Yeah, and so the Fifth Amendment, we're going to take the last part of the Fifth Amendment here, which is what's known as the Takings Clause. And what that does is it really establishes, it connects with the founding generation's commitment to property rights. And what it says is that the government can't take our property unless it's going to use it for public use, so it being used for the good of the community, and they're going to pay us a fair price for this. And so this is the government. Sometimes they will take people's homes in order to do something big for the community. This makes sure that people are treated fairly when that happens.
Awesome. And the first part of it really leads us into the next subgrouping: fair process, jury rights, and rights of the accused. So fifth kind of gets double buckets here. So you want to start with fifth and then we'll jump into sixth?
Sure. So the rest of the Fifth Amendment really does. It has to do with fair process. So it has certain rights for criminal defendants, things like the right to right against self-incrimination. This is when you hear people say, you have the right to remain silent, or I plead the fifth. That's right there. They're referring to the Fifth Amendment when they say that. It also establishes a right to due process of law. So this is a fair process. You have a right to a fair process before the government takes away your life, your liberty, or your property. It's a really big idea about fairness. So that's the Fifth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment then grants even more rights to criminal defendants. Things like rights to a jury trial, right to a lawyer, the right to be informed of what the government's accusing you of, the right to cross-examine witnesses against you in person. So these are all fair processes which are meant to ensure that if people are punished, that they are actually guilty. We want to give people the ability to have a fair process to make their case before we find them guilty of a crime. The Seventh Amendment then extends the jury trial to what are known as civil cases. These are just basically any cases that aren't criminal cases, that aren't violations of criminal law. They're civil cases. We don't talk a lot about this one today, but it really did arise from deep concerns from the anti-federalists during the ratification battles over the Constitution. And finally, the Eighth Amendment is one that we often see associated with death penalty cases. It's the right against cruel and unusual punishment, excessive bail, or excessive fines. Again, this one grew out of anti-federalist concerns. People like Patrick Henry of Virginia, concerned that this new and powerful national government is going to simply invent new crimes and do really bad punishments to people for violating them. And so they wanted to make sure that this protection was written into the Bill of Rights.
And I find a lot of students love talking about the Eighth Amendment, and it is really one that we could have great conversations on as well. Now, the next two parts of the Bill of Rights are looking at the idea of popular sovereignty. So the Ninth and 10th Amendment. And Tom, as you dive into this, can you help the students understand what does the word popular sovereignty mean as we group these next two together, and then we can see it in the amendments?
Absolutely. So popular sovereignty is the idea of rule by we the people. So we're not ruled by a king, but our government is driven by us. Part of that is that we retain certain rights that the government can't take away from us, so our natural rights. Part of that, too, for the founding generation was ensuring that a lot of decision-making would be made by state and local governments, the governments that were closest to us, the American people. So with the Ninth Amendment, what we see here is, for many scholars, they argue that this is making sure that there are protections for certain natural rights in the Constitution. Above all, what it's meant to tell us is that the American people, they retain rights that aren't necessarily written in the Constitution itself. A concern for someone like James Madison was that if we list out all the rights in the Bill of Rights, we may forget some. And because of that, people might end up with fewer rights than they had before. The Ninth Amendment tells us not to read the Constitution that way. And the 10th Amendment is meant to protect the traditional powers of the states. So before the new Constitution, the states had a ton of power. The national government had virtually none. And the 10th Amendment is telling us that the states still retain a lot of power to do things that affect people's lives.
And I think that's really, really interesting to see the states as a representative of the people in this mindset during the Bill of Rights. Now, there's two other founding era amendments that aren't in those Bill of Rights. They come a little bit later, just 4 years later. So can you go over the 11th and 12th really quickly?
Sure. The 11th Amendment really quickly is all about whether or not states can be sued in national courts. Anti-federalists were really, really concerned that ordinary citizens would be able to pull states into court. There was an early case called Chisholm versus Georgia in 1793, where the Supreme Court said, yeah, a citizen, a resident of South Carolina can haul Georgia into court and ask them to account for whatever they've done. This confirmed the anti-federalist fears. This was a really controversial decision. And we get the 11th Amendment here defending the powers and traditional independence of the states. So that's basically what happens there. But the cool thing about the amendment is it's an amendment that responds to a Supreme Court decision the American people thought was wrong, which we see multiple times. So that's the 11th Amendment.
Ooh, the
12th Amendment is all about the Electoral College. And so with the original Electoral College, the electors cast their ballots for not for one presidential candidate, but for two. So, what we wound up seeing with this process, though, is that it ran into serious problems early on in both the 1797 and the 1800 election. In 1796, what happened was John Adams ran against Thomas Jefferson. John Adams won that race, but Thomas Jefferson finished in second place. So Thomas Jefferson, his political opponent, became his vice president. Imagine Donald Trump being Joe Biden's vice president right now. That system didn't work particularly well. And then also in the election of 1800, we see a rematch, this time Thomas Jefferson beating John Adams. But Thomas Jefferson tied in the Electoral College with his running mate, Aaron Burr, 73-73. Thomas Jefferson, we all knew, was at the top of the ticket, but Aaron Burr tried to game the process with a tie. It then went to the House of Representatives. There was a big controversy, many balloting, many days. Eventually, Thomas Jefferson won, but the American people concluded we need to fix this process. The founders didn't foresee we were going to have political parties. But what the 12th Amendment makes, there's still two votes in the Electoral College, but one is specifically for president, one is specifically for vice president. So we no longer have those ties between running mates, but also we do not have a situation where political opponents, where one is the president and one is the vice president.
I can't even imagine that today. Okay, now fast forward to the Reconstruction time period. So we're talking end of the Civil War, 1865 to 1870. Again, group these together for the students. These three really do come one after the other, and they're seen by scholars as a second founding. So you talked about that earlier, that it's such a transformational change to the Constitution. And that was one of our questions. How much did these amendments change the original Constitution? We saw it with the last amendment, changing the Electoral College process. But these three big ones, how much do they change the original Constitution?
Well, they're huge. They're hugely transformational. They're monumental changes. And so there are three amendments, again, in rapid succession. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment writes the promise of freedom and equality into the Constitution. The 15th Amendment ends racial discrimination in voting. These are really, really big things. What the Reconstruction generation is trying to do, so this is that period right after the Civil War, and they're trying to define what the Constitution needs to mean in a post-Civil War America. They're trying to set new constitutional rules, better rules that are going to guide America from then and into the future. And with that, just to tick through a couple of them here, Curry, remember the Constitution was originally silent on the issue of slavery. Slavery, the word wasn't in the Constitution, but there were parts of the Constitution that tilted political power in the direction of slaveholding states. And with the 13th Amendment, we actually abolish slavery. We do something that seemed impossible before the Civil War, but we do it through the 13th Amendment. We also see in the original Constitution, it didn't say anything about equality. It didn't say anything about African-American voting rights. And the Bill of Rights itself, ratified shortly after the original Constitution, only applied to the national government. With the 14th Amendment, what we do is that we say everyone born in the United States is American citizen. So we set a national citizenship standard. We promise equality for all. And we make sure that the Bill of Rights protections extend to the states. And so the Bill of Rights really becomes a charter of national freedom. And finally, again, the original Constitution, silent on African-American voting rights. With the 15th Amendment, we promised to ban racial discrimination in voting. So these are really big, big, big changes, Curry.
And one thing, I love that, and students will dive into these amendments very deeply in upcoming weeks. But the one thing you said earlier about the what was it, the 12th Amendment or the 11th Amendment is that there was a court case, and this amendment changes the outcome of that court case, because the 11th Amendment, because people weren't happy about it. Was it Chisholm? Did I remember that correctly? Yeah. So could you tell us, when we look at the beginning of the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment is changing and fixing what court case that it was not right for the United States Constitution?
Sure. So just before the Civil War, there's a case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. And the Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney said that, quote, that African Americans can't be United States citizens, and they, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And the 14th Amendment, really all of the Reconstruction Amendments are meant to overturn the Dred Scott decision. But that first sentence there carried the citizenship clause: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Is meant directly to say, no, Supreme Court, Chief Justice Taney, you were wrong. African Americans can be United States citizens, and that they are free and equal like all other Americans.
And I just love that concept that, we talk about amending the Constitution for so many reasons, but sometimes we don't talk about by righting a wrong that maybe the courts have laid out. And so amending the Constitution is a way that if you see a Supreme Court case that isn't the way we want to move forward, people can get together and work with Congress to change that. Looking at that separation of powers and the checks and balances in action right here with the 11th and the 14th. Okay, next grouping, the Progressive Era. So the Progressive Era, 1930 to 1920. Why do they call it the Progressive Era, Tom? And then tick us through 16, 17, and through 19.
Progressive Era is connected with the broader progressive movement. I would say there are two big ideas that you see with the progressive movement more broadly. The government doing more stuff in a lot of different contexts, and also making the various processes more democratic in an attempt to really root out corruption in our political process. So this amendment 16 through 19, it's like a 7-year period where we amend the Constitution 4 times. The 16th is another example of an amendment overturning a Supreme Court decision. So in a 5-4 Supreme Court decision from 1895, Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust, the Supreme Court curbs Congress's power to pass an income tax. And so the progressive movement and even the populist movement come out and they say, no, Supreme Court, you're wrong. Congress has they've passed income taxes in the past, and it's consistent with the Constitution. What we need to do is amend the Constitution to tell the Supreme Court that it was wrong in Pollock and that Congress could pass an income tax. And the 16th Amendment grows out of that movement activism and tells the Supreme Court again, no, you were wrong. We, the people, have a different answer to that question. So it gives Congress the power to pass an income tax. The 17th Amendment has to do with how we elect senators. Under the original Constitution, United States senators were elected by state legislatures. The 17th Amendment gives us the system we have today, which is that United States senators are elected by the American people, by the voters. And this was seen really for the reformers important in two different ways. One is that it was seen as more broadly consistent with the expansion of American democracy over time. The other is that for some reformers, it was seen as a way of checking corrupt influence in state legislatures. Their concern was that there were a lot of moneyed interest in state legislatures that were effectively buying and selling Senate seats, and people didn't like that. So that's the 17th Amendment.
And just remember, people, we didn't vote for senators directly until 1913. That always blows my mind. I just have to point that out. Okay, Tom, 18th Amendment. So we were talking about this earlier. What was going on, and what happened with the 18th Amendment?
So the 18th Amendment is the one example of an amendment that we just repeal, that we get rid of in its entirety. So we'll take the 18th and then the 21st Amendment together. Both of these amendments deal with prohibition. This is the fight against alcohol use in this country. And, in part, it's important to note that this amendment, it grows out of a social movement, the prohibition movement, and it grew out of a real societal problem. The American people drank a lot, and this led to, lost wages at the saloon, abuse at home, people losing their jobs. So reformers were responding to a real problem. The prohibition movement itself brought together a coalition of sometimes overlapping groups, but sometimes groups that were against each other on other issues. But it was a combination of the progressives, the suffragists, the populists, the nativists, and white Southerners, and they worked for decades to try to cut alcohol use in America, and it culminated in the 18th Amendment, banning alcohol and implementing prohibition nationwide. And so that's the 18th Amendment, but it only lasted 13 years. And with the 21st Amendment, we decide to repeal the 18th Amendment. We decide to turn away prohibition because problems soon arose with prohibition. And so this is a reminder that sometimes the American people conclude that we reformed the Constitution, but we made a mistake and we want to do something else. And prohibition wound up having a bunch of different failures associated with it. It was easy to defy, difficult to enforce. There was a huge black market for alcohol, gave rise to organized crime. Law enforcement didn't do much to combat it. And as a result, Americans became concerned that prohibition really made a mockery of the Constitution and the rule of law. So with the 21st Amendment, they decide prohibition, the 18th Amendment, it had to go.
And I love, we did a real quick redirect and that was a bad idea. Let's go back. But the 18th Amendment also is directly connected with the 19th Amendment. And again, ensuring that women have power over themselves, power over their property, power over their lives and safety, but also the right to vote, to get representation that speaks for them as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about the 19th Amendment?
Yeah, so the 19th Amendment ends sex discrimination in voting. The original Constitution left the issue of voting largely to the states, but what we see over time is a series of voting rights amendments that expand voting rights protections to different groups based on race with the 15th Amendment, based on age with the 26th Amendment. And here with the 19th, it's about the women's right to vote. What's a cool part of this story, Curry, is that it didn't come out of nowhere. It began out west. We see states by states using federalism to experiment giving women the vote. It worked well. The idea then spread towards the east, and it eventually is written into the Constitution with the 19th Amendment.
And I love that idea. So women could vote in certain states, and they were states that wanted to bring women to their state as well. There was lots of different reasons for it. And then it just spreads as a bubbling up idea. And that national amendment says, no, okay, for a nation, we are going to say that this principle is in the Constitution, cannot be denied based on sex. Now, this jumps us into the modern era. And we're going to hit the 20th Amendment. We just did the 21st and tick through a few of these as well. So let's begin with what is the 20th Amendment and how is it connected to the president?
Sure. So we could do these next few amendments pretty quickly. The 20th Amendment is probably the most forgotten and obscure amendment. What it does is it reduces the length of time between the most recent national election and when a new Congress and president take office. Before the 20th Amendment, the new Congress, so the new president and Congress would be elected in November, wouldn't take office until March. We moved that date then up to January with the 20th Amendment. So that way, just reducing the length of time between election and when a new government takes over.
Okay, we'll jump to the 22nd Amendment next.
So the 22nd Amendment limits a president to 2 terms in office. So George Washington, when he was president, served 2 terms and then retired from office. Every president from Washington until FDR did the same thing. Then FDR ran for re-election a bunch of different times. He was elected 4 times as president. Afterwards, the American people said, no, we don't like that. We like what Washington did better. And so that we then write that Washington precedent into the Constitution with the 22nd Amendment.
And then we now move to the 23rd. We are flying now.
Yeah, the 23rd Amendment granted the District of Columbia 3 electoral votes, adding their voices to the presidential selection process. This was important. It was connected with the civil rights movement. So look, it's 1961. There's a large African-American population in Washington, D.C. And so this was a way of giving them a voice in national elections.
Awesome. That's really interesting. Okay, as we keep kind of cruising through these 60s amendments, we also have the 24th Amendment that, again, is connected to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, so the 24th Amendment bans poll taxes in national elections. Poll taxes were used by many southern states to keep African Americans away from the polls. And so it basically charged a tax to be able to vote, and it gave a way to exclude African Americans from the ballot box to limit their 15th Amendment protections of their right to vote. And the 24th Amendment was ratified. 5 states still had poll taxes: Mississippi, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, and Alabama. The 24th Amendment said, no, you can't do this in national elections. And then the Supreme Court, just a couple of years later in 1966, in a case called Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections, said that no, all poll taxes for national, state, and local elections, they all have to go.
And that feels like it's mind-blowing that you would have to pay a tax to be able to vote. It seems so insane today, but this is just 1964. So 1967 goes back to a presidential amendment.
Yeah, so here, this covers the issue of presidential succession and incapacity. This 1967, that we began thinking about these issues because of JFK's assassination in November 1963. And so the 25th Amendment answers a few different questions. One, it says that when a president dies, resigns, or is removed from office, the vice president becomes president. Then Section 2 sets out the process for filling an open seat for the vice presidency. And then Section 3 permits the president to temporarily transfer power by written statement, say if they're like going into surgery or something like that. And then Section 4 addresses the situation where a president refuses to transfer his power when others conclude that he's unable to fulfill them. But all these things have to do with presidential succession and disability.
Now, 26th Amendment, this is the one I was referencing earlier. This comes out really quickly. I think I always forget it's like 6 to 9 months, less than a year. We get the 26th Amendment, and it's about voting rights not being denied by age, by certain ages. So tell us a little bit about the amendment and why it was so fast. What was going on?
It was ratified in 4 months. It's the fastest amendment ratified, which is it's amazing. Effectively, what it does is it lowers the national voting age to 18 years old. Prior to the 26th Amendment, most states still limited voting to those 21 years or and older. But if you look at the date, 1971, this is in response in part to the Vietnam War and the concern that we have people who are going and serving and sacrificing their lives or willing to do so in Vietnam, but then coming home and they're too young to be able to vote. So we lowered the voting age. We said, if you're old enough to fight for your country, you're old enough to vote in this country.
Awesome. And the last one, and students, you're doing a great job, is the 27th Amendment. And this is a cheers to every C student or every person who has ever gotten a C on a paper that they've written. You can still change the Constitution with a C. So tell us a little bit about what the 27th Amendment does, but also the story about the C student.
Sure. So look, the date here, it's 1992. This is a really, really weird amendment because the amendment itself, it's written by James Madison. So this amendment, this language is part of the original package that became the Bill of Rights, but it ends up in the Constitution over 200 years later because of a passionate student that's angry about a really, really bad grade that he got on his homework assignment. So this amendment itself, it prevents members of Congress from raising their own salaries until there's been a new election. So a pay increase doesn't take effect until a new Congress sits as a way of checking possible abuses where Congress just keeps raising its own salary. James Madison in the first Congress wrote it. It's approved by Congress, so it's proposed to the states for ratification, but only 6 states approve it. So while the other Bill of Rights, they're ratified, this one is not ratified. So it just sits out there. And for many years, maybe a couple states might vote to ratify, but mostly no one's thinking about it. Certainly no one thinks it's going to be ratified at any point in time until Gregory Watson, who you see right there. He's assigned, he's a sophomore at the University of Texas when he's assigned a paper, not in that picture, but when he's assigned a paper, he has to write about any sort of governmental process. He picks up a book that has a bunch of different amendments that had been proposed but not ratified. And he sees this text of what becomes the 27th Amendment. He argues in his paper that Madison didn't put in place any time limit as to when this thing had to be ratified, so that it could even still be ratified today. So how did he do on his paper? He got a C. And so he protests to his professor, says, this is a better paper than that. Give me a higher grade. The professor says no. So he's angry. And so he stops appealing to his professor, and instead he decides, I'm going to appeal to the American people. I think this amendment is a good idea. I think it can be ratified, and I'm going to do it. So he writes to legislators throughout the country. Eventually, it's picked up by a powerful senator, Senator William Cohen of Maine. He thinks it's a great idea. Cohen pushes through ratification in Maine. Watson continues to push and push state by state until finally in 1992, over 2 centuries after the first Congress proposed the amendment to the states, 3/4 of the states, 38 of 50, voted to ratify it, and it became the 27th Amendment to our Constitution.
I find the story so hysterical. And then he did go back to his teacher, and the teacher finally said, okay, I will give you an A on the paper, which cracks me up that he did that. Like, he was like, I'm going to get this done. It's a great amendment to the Constitution. And that's what we always want to have a conversation about. What would be an amendment that you think would be needed to be added to the Constitution? And then think about how that process would actually play out. I was reading up on Watson last night, and he was actually looking at the Equal Rights Amendment as something to write the paper on as he was digging through those books and found this Madison Amendment. So really fascinating ones. You could even start with students what's already proposed, because there's been tens of thousands of amendment ideas floating around and proposed. So you can pull a Watson and do that as well and get good ideas that are already out there. So thank you so much, Tom. This was a great class. I'm going to stop the screen sharing and recording right now, but if there's any questions, we will hold up for a minute. We know it was a lot in a little over 27 minutes. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much, everyone.